So let's think for a moment about how messages can attract people. A pastor I know walked into church one Sunday morning to see a lady he'd never seen before sitting by herself. When a new visitor wandered into his church on a Sunday morning, he always tried to ask how they happened to come to that church that day. Her response was that she came because the sermon title on the front of the church and the notice board, the message that he was preaching on that day, was How to Hear God Speak. And she said she saw the title and she said to herself, that message is for me. So message titles are important. They should attract people, grab people. When the title of a future message is put in a bulletin or on a notice board outside the church, it alone, in some way, should have the potential to bring people in to hear just that message. And if you, people who consistently create good titles and put them in an environment when they can be seen would testify that strangers do appear and sometimes return because it is the title that grabbed them and the message lived up to it. A good title creates a sense of expectancy. The titles can also create a sense of expectancy. For people who are planning to come to a service anyway, knowing the title in advance can create a sense of expectation. Of course, not all titles attract people or create expectancy. In reality, vague, anemic, generic, or even abstract titles are common. But really, my friends, titles need to be fashioned into something specific, addressing particular topics. Don't use abstract terms in titles. Transform them and make them something personal. Titles that attract people generally tend to pose questions and suggest there may be solutions, or they appeal to interest, or they appeal to the needs of the people who will see it. The most effective titles contain the hope, the promise of a benefit for a listener. Thinking about various categories of titles that can benefit, that have been shown to be effective, can be divided into various categories. And reviewing these categories during title preparation will help you probe some possibilities. Categories of title you can choose are subject titles. Now, this is probably the most common, and although effective, can be a bit boring sometimes. Some titles simply announce the subject of the message. Such titles appeal to people who are more interested in the subject. Those interested in prophecy would be attracted by the title The Meaning of the Rapture, but probably less so to people from an unchurched background. Some subjects, though, may have a general appeal, like how to deal with hard times, or the greatest lesson you can learn in life, or how to experience maximum joy. You can see how those titles might be more effective in reaching and connecting with an audience outside of a church background. As well as a subject title, you can use what's called a statement title. A declaration statement can deliver a very strong sort of psychological punch. For example, can you marry the wrong person? Is God seeking you? Those are both statements that will certainly get people's attention. But probably nothing grabs people better than a personal question. If it's something important to them, personal questions can arouse great curiosity. Example of question titles I've used in the past are, can you lose your salvation, or is the Bible reliable? Then, in a world that loves to have self-improvement and self-help guides, sometimes to give a title classified as a how-to title automatically conveys the impression that the message here is going to be practical and helpful. Here are some samples. How to be happy. How about this one? How to be happy even when married. How to get your prayers answered. How to prevent conflict. How to handle difficult times. all useful ways of getting people to realize that there are problems in life that need addressed, and maybe what you're going to say will help. Another category is what is referred to as the direct address title. Titles can be directly addressed to the listener. They should leave out the word you, but the types of titles can call attention to something because we already know it's what people will be thinking. Things like how to prepare yourself, be aware of being sidetracked, or don't settle for second best. Other good titles, particularly as attention grabbers, are titles with a twist. Now, a twist can be an old expression that is especially good but put in a new way, and these type of titles are really good attention grabbers. Something like, don't do something, just stand there. Madness can be a blessing. God writes with graffiti. Another type of title, that's from Daniel, actually, by the way, that sermon title. Other useful category of sermon titles would be what I would call the current events titles. Any titles that deals with a current event will generate interest. Here are titles that I have used over the last 20 years when these topics or when events occurred. The Now Generation. What does Jesus Christ think of? And then I put in the sort of the moral ambiguity that is in the media at that time. The Real Exorcist. Is there a curse in our nation? Reflections on 9/11 was one of the earliest sermons I preached. But also since then, I've used the title Reflections on, and then sadly just inserted the most recent terrorist atrocity. The final test is once you think you've got a title, is to select and to decide if you've really. It's also useful when it comes to deciding a title to have some sort of test, some sort of method by which you select which title to use. One way to come up with the most effective title is to write down a number of possibilities using the categories I've talked about from the list above and decide which is the best one. It's quite reasonable that you can take a passage of scripture, create a sermon, and then test these categories of title as ways of thinking about which one is best by asking questions like, does it fit the occasion? Does it interest the particular group whom I'm going to be speaking to? Would anyone specifically come to hear this message based on the title? But you've got to be also aware of negative reactions to it. In other words, will some people question whether this message is believable, or does the title promise more than the message will be able to deliver? So in summary, let me just say that effective messages usually have titles that attract people's attention. Now, other categories exist, such as appealing to curiosity. It's also possible for the same message to have several different appealing titles from several different categories, which is why it's useful to think about them from more than one perspective. For example, the message of John 3, which is, if you remember the story of Nicodemus being told that he needs to be born again, I have spoken on that chapter and preached in that chapter probably half a dozen times in my life and drawn different teaching and points out of it. But here are some of the titles that I have given to messages on that passage, which look at different aspects of it. The Teacher Who Failed His Own Course. How to Start Life All Over Again. You too. How can you too have a new beginning? Being good is not good enough. Being religious is not good enough. How to become a child of God. How to join God's family. So you can see they're all dealing with the same issue, but using different titles from different categories that I've just listed for you in the past. I hope that's been helpful.